few months ago, my neighbor passed away. Or, to be more precise, the man who lived just close enough to be considered a neighbor. Our houses sit at least a quarter-mile apart, with a field in between, then a broad pasture where sheep wander. Only at dusk, when warm light glowed behind his windows, would I catch a fleeting glimpse of his place. Here in northern Maine, people live so far apart that you can share a property line for years and never do more than toss each other a brief nod if you happen to cross paths. That's how it was for us, side by side for nearly 2 decades. Occasionally, we'd acknowledge each other. My dog and I out for a walk, him passing in his battered old Ford pickup. Most of what I knew about my neighbor, who must have been about 30 years older than me, came from secondhand stories. He'd spent years on the road as a traveling salesman, and folks whispered that he had a certain eccentricity. Once upon a time, he hosted wild parties, but after his wife passed, he withdrew from nearly everyone. Over the last few years, the only visitors I ever noticed were the occasional home health aide or delivery driver. He and his wife had furnished the place themselves. On the outside, it looked unassuming. A single-story ranch house, painted white, with dark blue shutters, stretching toward the Atlantic coast. But inside, so I'd heard, it was extraordinary. Thick, emerald green carpeting, dim wallpaper, several small bars, sweeping picture windows that looked out across the miles of salt marsh, clusters of deep red leather sofas, and low black glass tables topped with hefty ashtrays. Locals told all kinds of tales about the couple's unusual taste. Supposedly, they'd upholstered doors, and even the insides of closets with leopard print fabric. The decor sounded like something from a swanky American home in the 1970s. Yet, the years had turned those once chic elements into something worn and dated, with a style that felt downright eerie to modern eyes. Someone in town compared it to one of those unsettling sets you'd see in the TV series Twin Peaks. I'd never crossed the threshold myself until the place went up for sale. Curious to see how my enigmatic neighbor had lived, I pretended to be a prospective buyer. Wandering through the rooms, I found the stories I'd heard were spot on. One detail, however, puzzled me. His wife's presence lingered as though she'd never left. Clothes still hung in her closet, even though she'd been gone for years. One bedroom, presumably hers, remained untouched. At the vanity, her brushes, nail polish, perfume bottles, and little boxes lined the tabletop, as if waiting for her return. It struck me then how profoundly he must have grieved her, how his own spark had faded, time halting the moment she died. Feeling more than a little uncomfortable, I thanked the realtor for the viewing. I'd masqueraded as an interested buyer simply to satisfy my curiosity, to peek at the secrets behind those drawn curtains. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the house from my mind. The stale odor tinged with cigarette smoke, the sensation of old sorrow that clung to every corner, a haunting emptiness that almost seemed to creep under my skin. Night after night, I was plagued by a disturbing dream. In it, I'd be walking at twilight over barren fields that stretched on indefinitely. Everywhere I looked, I saw the twisted juniper bushes, their branches misshapen, silhouetted against a darkening sky. Even though I was alone in sight, I felt watched, intensely, unrelentingly. That sensation intensified until I broke into a run, not knowing where I was headed. Suddenly, I tripped and went sprawling. My foot snagged in a tangle of branches. I struggled to get up, but my ankle was caught fast. Then I heard laughter behind me. Turning, I made out 2 figures in the deepening gloom, a man and a woman. They were looking at each other, their faces lost in shadow, apparently unaware of me lying on the ground. I tried to cry out for help, but my voice wouldn't come. Gasping, I clutched at my throat. In that moment, they turned toward me. I still couldn't see their faces, but I could hear them laughing. I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, reaching for the lamp on my bedside table. Even after a moment to catch my breath, I'd sense something moving under the blanket beside me. Summoning my courage, I'd yank the covers back, only to see that same man and woman from my dream lying there, their faces illuminated, smiling as they stretched their hands toward my neck. At that point, I'd wake again, this time for real, soaked in a cold sweat, and trying to get back to sleep after that was impossible. I'd sit up, push aside the drapes, and stare at my neighbor's dark silhouette across the way. A while after the property sold, new tenants began renting the old place. I hadn't met them yet, though I kept a quiet watch. No one appeared to clear out the man's personal effects. Spring warmed into early summer, and I occasionally spotted different cars driving up the lane, so I deduced there were short-term renters coming and going. But it seemed the interior remained exactly the way he left it when he died. One evening, while walking my dog, I came upon two women giggling to themselves. I guessed right away they were summer visitors and gave a neighborly "good evening." They stopped and struck up a conversation, tipsy with wine, apologies stumbling off their tongues. They mentioned renting the house on a vacation rental site because the photos made it look so oddly fascinating. The blonde one started to gush about some experience she'd had inside, but the dark-haired one cut her off, asking me about local sightseeing spots. I was just about to recommend the scenic coastal road looping around to the northern tip of the peninsula, where rocky cliffs give way to endless stretches of stone beaches, when the blonde woman interrupted me, eyes keen. "Do you know who used to live there?" she asked. "Did you know them personally?" I explained that I'd only ever seen the man from a distance, and that his wife had likely passed long before I'd even moved here in '99, and he'd been alone ever since. The blonde looked amazed. "We thought it was the other way around," she said, "that the wife was the last to die." "Why would you think that?" I asked. "Well, the closets are still full of women's clothes." I ventured a guess that the husband must have been unable to let go of her, so he never boxed up her things. "But there aren't any men's clothes left," she said, "which is really strange, isn't it?" I agreed it was odd. We talked a little longer about how bizarre it was for a place to be rented out with all those personal belongings untouched. Then, just as we were parting ways, the blonde woman said, "Oh, and there was a weird thing with the radio, too. Last night we were listening for the weather. Can you guess what happened?" I shook my head. "She turned it on," the blonde said, gesturing to her friend, "and we heard an older woman's voice coming out of the speaker saying, 'I'm here, I'm here, I will not disappear.' Pretty creepy, right?" The dark-haired woman forced a nervous laugh, claiming it must have been some actress on a radio play that had spooked them. "They told me not to worry. They'd figure things out." We parted, and I let them know I was just down the road if they ever needed help. That night, I lay awake, thinking of my old neighbor, realizing I couldn't recall his face up close. We'd exchanged nods plenty of times, but it was always from a distance. Had I never really gotten a good look, and I couldn't place the sound of his voice. He'd been a strange hermit while alive, and in death he became even more inscrutable. Eventually, I resorted to taking a sleeping pill, which only led me into a fitful half-sleep filled with jumbled fragments. I tossed and turned, images flickering like a broken reel, fleeing in total darkness, nowhere to hide. Gaunt figures slumped on the ground as I scrambled to avoid stumbling over them. The eerie sensation of a spider slowly crawling up my neck, my panic as I tried to brush it away. I awoke with a jolt, sheets tangled around my legs, the clock reading 3 in the morning. I'd slept hardly a few hours. Stumbling into the kitchen, I glanced through the window toward my neighbor's old place. A light was on there too. Trying to calm myself, I heated some milk with a dab of butter, an old remedy my grandmother swore by for sleepless nights when I was a child. The comforting warmth soon settled my nerves, and I ventured outside. Dawn was already hinting at the horizon, the crisp morning air tinged with that first glow of sunrise. Later in the day, I busied myself mowing the lawn, pruning the rose bushes, and tending a damp corner of my vegetable patch where, to my delight, some vigorous ramps had sprung up. Northern Maine soil can be fertile in the right spots, and I planned to make a simple ramp soup for lunch, which I savored in peaceful solitude on my porch. And then, out of nowhere, there she was, standing right in front of me, the blonde woman breathing hard, words tumbling out in frantic snippets. I only caught bits and pieces, but it was obvious she was badly shaken. She begged me to come to the house, almost yanking me along in her urgency. I barely had time to set down my bowl before she turned and sprinted away, glancing over her shoulder to make sure I followed. By the time I reached the porch of that old ranch house, I couldn't see or hear her anymore. I stepped inside, calling out a cautious, "Hello?" The interior looked exactly the same as the day of the open house, except for 3 suitcases lined up in the hall. It struck me that they must have been preparing to leave. I roamed from the living room to a small home office. No sign of life. I raised my voice, opened a bedroom door a crack, and saw the dark-haired woman perched on the edge of the bed, her back to me. She didn't respond when I asked if everything was all right. Gently, I laid a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, startled, as if I'd snapped her out of a trance. "Oh, there you are," the blonde woman blurted from behind me. "We have to go. Now this place is insane. Could you give the owner or whoever the key back?" She pressed the key into my hand, breathless. I asked what on earth had happened. She turned to her friend, trying to coax her to stand. The dark-haired woman stared blankly, as though in shock. Then, outside, we heard a car rolling up the driveway. "That's our driver, thank goodness," muttered the blonde. She sank onto a chair while her friend carried suitcases out. I crouched down and clasped the blonde woman's hands gently, saying, "Please, tell me what's going on." She didn't speak at first, gaze fixed on the wall. Finally, in a flat monotone, she murmured, "I went walking on the slope behind the house, looking for wildflowers among the juniper bushes. Then I got the sense someone, or something, was watching me. It kept getting stronger. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt it. I got spooked and headed back to the house. I stumbled, caught my foot on a branch, and that's when I heard laughter. 2 people laughing right behind me. I covered my ears and screamed. A moment later, Mary came running, asked what was wrong. She said she didn't see anyone, didn't hear a thing. She paused, shuddering. Mary got me inside and I collapsed into bed. At some point, I must have drifted off. Then I woke up all of a sudden and realized I wasn't in my own room, but in some other bedroom. The woman's bedroom, I think. I was confused, banging into the vanity in the dark. I looked out the window and saw the man with the dog across the field. He was still awake. His lights were on too. When I turned around, there was something moving in the bed I'd just left. I went over, pulled back the blanket, and there they were, an old man and an old woman, laughing the same way I'd heard outside. Then they reached for me with their hands. "Where are they now?" I asked. The blonde woman stepped forward before her friend could respond. "It's just feverish nightmares," she insisted. "She's been burning up, a bad dream, that's all." She leaned in, grabbing the last suitcase from me. "Come on, we have to leave." Supporting the dark-haired woman, she led her to the waiting car, clearly rattled. I followed, unsteady with confusion, and watched them slide into the back seat, slamming the doors. Then I got a good look at the vehicle. It was an old Ford pickup, the exact make and color my neighbor used to drive all those years. Something about it made my stomach twist. And then, as it pulled away, I saw the driver, a figure partly obscured by the windshield's glare. But for just a moment the light shifted, and I caught sight of an older woman's face. I couldn't place where I'd seen her before, but deep down, I was sure we'd crossed paths somehow. I stood there on the driveway, still holding the key, until their taillights disappeared into the distance. I live in an old apartment complex in the heart of Boston, very close to the university where I study. My apartment is old and quite outdated, but the rent is cheap. Because I only work part-time alongside my studies, I was thrilled to find an affordable place. Appearance wasn't that important to me. Moving into this apartment allowed me to keep living comfortably. I live alone, with no roommates, and initially I felt very comfortable in my apartment, with nothing strange happening during my first year there. The only thing that struck me as odd was that I kept finding random strands of blonde hair that clearly weren't mine. The first few times I didn't think much of it, but it started happening more frequently. One time, I settled into my armchair, only to spot a long blonde hair woven into the fabric. Another time, I was showering, and the same long blonde hair dangled from my shower curtain. It was weird, since I don't have any blonde friends. My friend Sarah has red hair, and my friend Jenna has jet black hair. My own hair is shoulder length and chocolate brown. For a whole year, I kept finding these strands of blonde hair and just chalked it up to them somehow coming off my clothes when I was outside. It didn't feel creepy enough to make me worry. However, after a full year, I was lying on my sofa one evening, watching Netflix, when I suddenly heard a girl say my name. I froze, unable to move. I was terrified. I didn't recognize the voice and definitely didn't want to find out who had said it. Suddenly, I remembered all those blonde hairs I had discovered over the past year. After sitting there stiffly for a couple of minutes, I searched my apartment. My door was locked, the windows were all shut, and no one was there. I told Sarah and Jenna about constantly finding the blonde hairs and the voice calling my name. At that point, it didn't seem too serious. They thought it sounded fascinating, and Sarah suggested having a sleepover to try and communicate with my ghost. Sarah is pretty into the paranormal, and Jenna and I agreed to it. We found the idea exciting at the time. Honestly, I don't think I fully believed what had happened, so we were all at my apartment and Sarah suggested talking to the ghost. She used her phone to record. We didn't catch anything on video, but Sarah still swears she heard a girl's voice saying, "Home." Jenna and I didn't hear anything. After a fairly fun night pretending to be ghost hunters, we all fell asleep in my bedroom. Jenna and I on my bed, Sarah on an air mattress on the floor. Around 2 a.m., Jenna suddenly started screaming, so loud and so horrifying. She was still asleep, and Sarah and I desperately tried to wake her, but she wouldn't snap out of it. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water and threw it in her face, which finally woke her up. She was distraught, terrified, and told us that she dreamt she was alone in my apartment when all the lights suddenly went off, and she felt someone else in there with her. She said she knew it was a dream but couldn't wake herself up, hence the screams. She insisted on leaving, and we were all so shaken that we walked out together and spent the rest of the night at Jenna's parents' house. Jenna didn't want to talk about the dream anymore and told me she had never experienced anything like that before, and she wouldn't come back to my apartment. She was, and still is, shaken by the experience. 2 months after Jenna's frightful episode, I was at the university and got a notification that my long-awaited package had been delivered successfully. I was confused because it was an expensive gadget, a GoPro that should have required a signature. I left campus right away and hurried back to my apartment, thinking it must have been left at my front door and worried someone might steal it. When I got there, it wasn't outside. I found it sitting on the kitchen counter. I knew my landlord must have been there because he has a key, and normally he'd let me know if he needed to come by. That annoyed me a bit because he usually explains why and when he's stopping over. I called him, but he denied being in the apartment and said he would have informed me if he'd come by, like he always does. That was true, and I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off, telling myself he just didn't want to admit he'd come in without permission. Another 2 months later, I finally got a new neighbor. The apartment next to mine, which is the only other apartment on our floor, had long been in disrepair and was just now being rented out to a sweet elderly lady. Her son helped her move in. He's in his 40s and seems like a good guy. He asked me to keep an eye on his mother since she'd be living on her own. I reassured him we live in a decent neighborhood, and I had never had any issues being alone in the building. Mrs. Hayes is a delightful older woman, and she often brings me leftovers from her meals. I help her take out the trash and sometimes pick up small items for her when I go shopping. We quickly became friends, and life went on as usual. Now, here comes the creepiest part, and I'll give you the conversation word for word. It's been a week since it happened, and I can't get it out of my mind. I had just come home from the university and was about to enter my apartment when I heard Mrs. Hayes call out to me from her doorway. "Hello, dear. Do you have a moment? I wanted to talk to you briefly." "Sure," I replied. "Is everything okay?" I walked over, and she waved me in, asking me to step into her apartment. We sat at her kitchen table, and she said something that made my blood run cold, something I'll never forget. "I'm not sure how to bring this up, but I've been thinking about it for a while, and I need to talk to you. I'm worried about the girl you're apparently living with. I understand she must be going through something, and I truly want to help as much as I can. But the constant crying all day is starting to affect my own life, too. I tried going over to comfort her, but she just keeps telling me she's fine and won't open the door." In my head, all the strange things that had happened flashed by in a rush, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Still," I said, "Mrs. Hayes, the crying must be coming from somewhere else. I live alone." Mrs. Hayes seemed shocked by my answer but quickly composed herself and said, "If you think I'm complaining, I'm not. I was just standing at your door today when she spoke to me through it and said she was fine. I've even seen her, so there's no reason to deny it. I'm not upset, I just want to clear this up." I started to panic. I had no idea what to say, but I kept insisting I lived alone. I led her into my apartment, and she looked concerned. I showed her my one-bedroom layout so she could see there was no one else there. Then she insisted on making me a cup of coffee back in her apartment, and I was more than happy to accept. She made me a coffee and told me how many times she's heard the crying and how she stood outside my door offering her help. She said the girl always replies in the same monotone voice, "I'm fine," and then the crying stops. At this point, I was practically trembling, and Mrs. Hayes noticed. One detail she mentioned stuck with me, and I summoned the courage to ask, even though I really didn't want to know. "You said you saw her. What does she look like? I heard your door open and thought it was you coming home." When I opened my door, I saw her going down the stairs. All I really saw was her blonde hair. My blood ran cold, and I could scarcely believe it. I told Mrs. Hayes everything about the blonde strands of hair, the sleepover, and the strange package delivery. She understood how shocked I was. She said I could stay with her, and so I did. We also decided to contact the landlord, hoping perhaps there was someone else who still had a key, and was wandering in and out of my apartment. The landlord was acting strangely, which was odd because he's normally a jovial guy who cracks a lot of jokes. This time, he just assured me no one else had a key, and then practically hung up on me. So, I'm back in my apartment now. The only people who know my story are Mrs. Hayes, Jenna, Sarah, and 2 friends from the university, James and Max. What should I do next? I know it all sounds unbelievable, and I've even considered bringing a priest in like they do in movies, but that just feels too embarrassing. What do I do? Alright, I thought I'd give you all an update on how things are going. Thank you for all your comments. They've really helped. First, I spoke to my landlord again. His name is Angelo. I believe he's originally from Italy, given his slight accent. I'd describe Angelo as a cheerful person, but he's been acting very odd lately. After ignoring a few of my calls, he finally called me back yesterday afternoon. He admitted it's possible the previous tenant still has a set of keys. I got angry and frustrated, but he cut me off and said, "Listen, it's not my fault." She stopped paying rent and wouldn't answer any of my calls. A whole month went by, so I dropped by to see what was going on. All her belongings were still there, everything. It looked like she had just stepped out. All the food in the fridge was spoiled, and it smelled awful, but it seemed like someone was still living in the place. I waited another month, tried calling her, and came by day and night, but nothing in the apartment changed. Eventually, I realized she wasn't coming back. Her purse was gone, so I assumed she ran out of money and took off. I reported her as missing to the police, but they asked for photos and a bunch of information, and I had nothing except her name, which they suspected was fake. They basically said it was obvious she'd just run away, and that they'd investigate, but nothing ever came of it. So, I brought in a cleaning crew and put the apartment back on the market. One particular phrase he used kept echoing in my head. I had rented the place partially furnished, but I never realized the furniture wasn't Angelo's. It was hers. Angelo confirmed this, and I immediately felt sick. Of course, I got her name, first and last. Though the police believed the name was fake, I decided to do some digging on my own. She said her name was Lucy. I searched across all social media platforms, trying to find her rare surname, maybe locate her family. After sending out several messages to possible relatives, I came up empty. Angelo passed me her phone number and told me she had no emergency contacts, which I found odd. He rents out his units privately and apparently now asks for a lot more info than he did when he rented to Lucy. It seems he learned from the experience. Last night, James came by and we thoroughly searched the apartment again. There's nowhere someone could be hiding. Nowhere at all. Then, the weirdest thing happened, and I'm still struggling to make sense of it as I write this. I was lying in bed, nearly asleep, on the side facing the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. I keep the bathroom light on because I can't stand sleeping in complete darkness. The door moved a little, which immediately drew my attention. There I was, my eyes wide open, staring at the door, focusing on the thin strip of light near the hinges. Suddenly, I noticed something blocking part of the light, like a person's silhouette. My heart was pounding so fast, but I knew that if it really was her in my apartment, I had to confront her. I jumped up so quickly and got to the bathroom in seconds, looking behind the door. No one. The bathroom is tiny, but I checked anyway. I couldn't believe there was no one there, because I was sure I'd seen something. When I went back to bed, there was no shape blocking the light anymore. In order to calm myself down, I told myself that since I was nearly asleep, maybe I'd had a brief waking dream. I'm not sure. I really don't know what to think anymore. Today I spoke to Angelo again, telling him I wanted to change the locks and that it was his responsibility. He agreed and said he would get some quotes and get back to me. 20 years ago, when I was 5, I met her for the very first time. I was suffering from intense social anxiety and was a very introverted child. Back then, I had no friends. While other kids played outside, I usually stayed in my room in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of Providence, Rhode Island, or lost myself in books. My parents were often busy with work, so they didn't notice my struggles. But my fear of dealing with others came with one advantage. It turned me into an extremely observant child. Every evening, I would look out my window and watch the neighborhood kids play. My loneliness attuned me to the smallest details, such as the faded color of a t-shirt or the odd behavior of a stray dog before it eventually passed away from arthritis. I grew fond of gazing at the house across the street. There was something strangely captivating about it. Just last month, a new family had moved in there. One evening, the curtain in the second-floor window of that house was drawn back. A girl stood there, about my age. She looked at me, and we both locked eyes in a peculiar, silent standoff. Yet, she had an unusual feature. The right side of her face was wrapped in white cloth, almost like a mummy's bandage. We stared at each other quietly for a while, until she pulled out a small writing pad and scribbled in messy handwriting. "Who are you?" I grabbed my own little pad and wrote, "My name is Lucas." "And you?" "I'm Emily," she replied. That was how we began to communicate, through our boards, held up to our respective windows. I learned a lot about her. She loved biology and had stacks of heavy textbooks on the subject. She was a bookworm like me. Supposedly, her parents were well-known scientists who worked for a major research facility in Seattle. After an accident the previous year, she had come down with an illness, and they wouldn't let her go outside. Her parents said she fell down the stairs into a large chemical tank in their basement. Apparently, the reason her face was half covered. But she had no recollection of the accident herself, and I suspected her mind had suppressed the traumatic memory. Months passed, and Emily and I continued chatting with our boards. I considered visiting her in person, but she said her parents would never permit it. In time, I noticed we had more in common than I had initially thought. I truly enjoyed our silent dialogues, yet something about the situation seemed off. It wasn't her, it was her parents. They rarely left the house, seemed aloof, wore clothes bearing a strange red anchor emblem, and their disheveled hair and odd red stains on their shirts unsettled me. Emily became anxious whenever she talked about them, and I knew that something wasn't right. I began observing them secretly, watching their behavior from behind curtains. They often talked about the experiment, boasting that they had made a groundbreaking scientific discovery. But for parents who supposedly wanted a cure for their daughter, they didn't speak much about caring for her. That was when I realized that they didn't genuinely care about poor Emily. Maybe because I loved superhero comics and horror movies, I found their cold disregard for her well-being frightening, like villains in a twisted story. Though my own parents weren't especially affectionate, her parents' icy indifference was another level of terrifying. Yet something didn't quite fit. If they were legitimate scientists from a major lab, wouldn't they keep their research better hidden? And if their discoveries were so dangerous that they had harmed Emily, who in their right mind would leave a huge, unsecured chemical tank in a basement, especially with a 5-year-old in the house? Nothing about this lined up. Emily barely knew her own parents, so little that it was disturbing. Several times she warned me not to provoke them and to keep our budding friendship a secret. No child should feel the need to say such things about their parents. I also noticed that every Wednesday, Emily's bandage was changed. Over time, the dressings extended slowly across more of her face, bit by bit. Gradually, my alarm grew. I had to stop this nightmare. I had to rescue her from those people. The longer she stayed with them, the more frightened and injured she appeared. I saw only fear in her eyes. Her small hands shook. She was clearly weakening. She needed a hospital. Then came a fateful Wednesday when I finally glimpsed what was really happening behind those windows. Normally, I would have been at school that day, but there was a local holiday and classes were canceled. So I sat by my window. What I witnessed that afternoon still haunts me. Emily's so-called parents dragged her out of her bed. They ripped away the bandages, revealing her face. It was horrifying. There were extra eyes and mouths. Her irises glowed red and cat-like, and her teeth were like knives. She wasn't human. They started beating her into a corner. Her screams filled the room, blood staining her clothes. These monsters then poured some strange liquid over her face. She howled in pain. Parts of her flesh seemed to melt, and one of her razor-sharp teeth fell out. They collected that tooth and tucked it away in their pockets. I couldn't watch the brutality any longer. Human or not, she was my first real friend. I banged on my window in desperation, trying to draw someone's attention. Her parents spotted me, their faces dark with anger, and tore downstairs to get at me. But I was quicker. I locked the doors and windows, raced to the landline phone, and charged up to my room. I heard them thumping at my front door as I dialed 911. The police arrived and took those maniacs into custody. It turned out they weren't legitimate scientists at all, and Emily wasn't even their biological daughter. They had adopted her from an orphanage in a small Appalachian town. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, though doctors said that some of the unnerving foreign growths on her face could be removed. The details afterward are a blur, but I vividly remember visiting Emily in the hospital. After she recovered, a loving couple from nearby adopted her. They showed her the genuine warmth and devotion that real parents should. One day, she asked me, "Lucas, are you dreaming again?" "Oh, I was just thinking about us." "Sorry, sweetheart," I answered. She leaned forward for a kiss, and her third eye gazed at me with tenderness. Had I not been standing at that window the day we met, my fiancé might still be trapped in that dreadful house to this day. Serial killer Henry Mueller, also known as the Clown of Brooklyn, lived comfortably in his old brownstone in Williamsburg, together with 26 other people, yet he felt profoundly lonely. He had neighbors, but what if they were the first to notice that something wasn't quite right? What would they do? What should they do? I ask myself these questions more and more often, as I begin to suspect that I might be the unsuspecting neighbor in this story, and I've decided it's time to face that possibility. Everyone has odd neighbors, and in Brooklyn you become all too familiar with certain curiosities. I work part-time at the little bodega around the corner, so I'm home more often than most. Honestly, I've barely put in any hours lately. Some might see that as a problem, inching me closer to unemployment and financial insecurity every week. But those are worries for another day. Instead, I'm seizing this chance to prove that something is very, very wrong next door. During all the extra time I've spent at home, I've noticed a few strange things about my neighbor Mr. Thompson's house. The first thing I picked up on was the smell. Mildew, that's exactly the scent. Our garages are next to each other, separated by a narrow walkway and a rusty chain-link fence. Lately, I've found it almost impossible to walk down that path. My stomach is tough enough, you get used to certain things around here. But my nose is sensitive, so, ever since that smell took over, I've chosen to haul my trash through the house and out to the curb on Tuesdays, passing by the typical Brooklyn backyards and the bustling neighborhood sidewalks. The next thing that caught my attention was Mr. Thompson's new friends and their weird robes. Every Thursday night for the past 2 weeks, 3 men in dark robes have been slipping in through his heavy rolling gate. They stay for a while, sometimes so long you'd think they were holding some secret, late-night meeting. Sure, I could call the cops, but in America, a strange smell and funny-looking guests aren't exactly crimes. It's no big deal for me if my neighbor's place stinks or if he hangs around with odd, questionably dressed buddies. The problem arises when the mildew smell and the 3 men in black robes show up at the same time. There has to be a connection. At this point, the only person I can really rely on to figure it out is me. On a typical Thursday evening, I come back from my shift at the bodega and begin phase 1 of my plan. It feels like a scene right out of Rear Window. I sit quietly in my small ground floor apartment, peering out through the worn window frames, waiting for the first sign. It materializes in the form of an old rolling gate groaning its way open, and then Mr. Thompson appears in a dark robe, greeting his new friends, all of them dressed in the same somber garments. Watching through my foggy kitchen window, I climb up on the battered bench beside it to get a better view. In that moment, caught in the rush of my own curiosity, adrenaline surges through me, and my hand slips. My forehead collides with a loud thump against the scuffed countertop, abruptly ending my voyeuristic endeavor in phase 1. Phase 2 begins with me sprawled out on the cold kitchen floor, racked with pain. My head is throbbing, and I recall that I really should have wiped down the bench after spilling a glass of water on it a few hours earlier. It's getting dark here in springtime Brooklyn, but there's still enough time. I call Joe's Slice, the local pizzeria on the next block, and order multiple pies to be delivered to Mr. Thompson's address on Marcy Avenue, specifically telling them to ring at the rolling gate. Sending someone else into that creepy building feels much safer than waddling over there myself. Plus, it gives me a chance to keep a close eye on what happens, hopefully without injuring myself again. After I hang up, I rush to the bathroom to assess the damage on my forehead. Following a quick sip of water to take the edge off my headache and a visit to the toilet, better safe than sorry, I pull on my darkest, most detective-like outfit, a black coat and a beanie, and slip quietly out the back door. At the fence that separates our houses, there's a row of thick, unkempt hedges. The advantage of using this path is that I remain out of sight. The disadvantage is that I'm smack in the middle of the nauseating mildew stench. Luckily, I came prepared. I stuff a small cloth soaked in ice water into my nostrils to block out most of the odor. Creeping through the narrow alley, I wedge myself into the bushes, surrounded by graffiti and the low hum of the city night, and settle in to wait. Unfortunately, Joe's Slice is notorious for slow deliveries, and even though I requested a 20-minute window, I brace myself for a long stint crouched in these dense hedges. From here, I can hear the noises coming from Mr. Thompson's place more clearly. It's tough to make out distinct words, but the voices are intense, accompanied by some ominous background music. Maybe classical layered with deep bass that sends a chill slithering into the pit of my stomach. A silver minivan pulls up on the opposite side of the street, near a brightly lit corner store. Its side sports a tacky pizza ad in red and white. The delivery guy steps out, and I realize I never thought this plan through at all. As he walks toward the garage, arms stacked with boxes, I start fidgeting in the bushes, heart pounding with the notion that if my worst suspicions are correct, who knows what horrors this poor guy might face. Regrettably, just the thought makes me panic, and that single jolt forces out the ice-cold cloth in my nose. Immediately, the full force of that foul smell hits me again, an overpowering mix of damp mildew and spoiled food, and I wonder if my stomach will tolerate it. The pizza guy knocks on the rolling gate, and I find myself wishing he hadn't listened to my instructions, the same way he didn't manage to arrive within 20 minutes. Had he tried the back door instead, I might have been able to intercept him before it was too late. For a second, I consider bursting out from my hiding place and doing something, anything, but my legs feel as cowardly as the rest of me. He knocks 3 times, and the gate slowly starts to lift. As I watch the old metal panel groan higher, I finally find the courage to intervene. If there's one thing I can accomplish in my life, it should be saving this unsuspecting man. I dart out of the bushes toward the gate, and that's when the horrible truth about what's happening in that creepy house hits me with full force. It's even worse than I imagined. Those dark robes are just costumes. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons. All 3 of the men are portraying wizards, a ridiculously goofy strategy for their imaginary quest, but perfectly ordinary for a gaming session in Mr. Thompson's living room. The last puzzle piece clicks when I hear, still standing unseen, Mr. Thompson telling the others that they'd actually planned on ordering pizza soon anyway. They'd even asked the delivery guy to knock on the front door rather than the garage, since the garage is closer to that unbelievably nasty hedge that a stray cat has apparently been using as its own personal dumping ground for dead rodents and trash, and that nobody's bothered to clean up yet. Everything is entirely ordinary. In other words, everything is normal, except for the freaked-out, foul-smelling neighbor who suddenly charged at them, eyes popping wide with fear, steeped in the stench of sweat, nausea, and raw panic. Before I can stop myself, I blurt out a barrage of rambling explanations about Henry Muller and some imagined secret passage full of corpses, as my words linger awkwardly in the hazy glow of the Brooklyn night. I realize there is no rational way to justify any of this. So, I turn on my heels and flee back to my brownstone, twisting my ankle in the process, stumbling more than once, until I finally limp to my front door in shame. I am the danger. I'm the neighbor who's been acting strange lately. Case closed. I live alone in a converted barn across from an old farmhouse in the Missouri countryside, connected by a narrow gravel road. The property once belonged to my grandparents and sat close to the wide waters of the Mississippi River, an idyllic spot if you can picture swaying cottonwood trees and lush cornfields. After my grandparents passed, their land was divided in 2. My mother's sister, Aunt Claire, and her longtime partner, Uncle Gary, took over the farmhouse, along with my cousin Martin, who later moved to another state. My mother inherited the barn, which I've been renting from her ever since. The entire region is known for heavy rainfall and frequent flooding, which makes farming next to impossible here. Over the years, nearly all our animals had to be sold or relocated. Only 1 cow and a small chicken coop remained. When COVID-19 hit Missouri, it hit us hard. We lost Aunt Claire to the virus. She had been the one keeping the farm afloat while Uncle Gary spent most of his days at the local bar, nursing cheap beer. Her death was the final blow to the place. That tragedy led to a bitter dispute over the rights to the old farmhouse. Aunt Claire and Uncle Gary had never married, so my mother insisted the house was rightfully hers. Nobody could say for sure who was correct, but we were all too deep in grief to think straight. Uncle Gary ended up selling the last cow, prompting a furious argument with my mother. Ultimately, he agreed to move out and stay with Martin for a while. When strict lockdown measures were enforced in the United States, housing became a hot commodity. My mother decided it might be profitable to rent out the farmhouse. I couldn't work due to the lockdown and couldn't pay my rent, so we struck a deal. I'd stay on and tend the chickens until things settled down. A new tenant arrived almost immediately. From the start, he felt off. Each morning, as I went out to feed the chickens, there he stood by the farmhouse's back door, quietly sipping a mug of freshly brewed coffee, likely from some local roastery in town, and watching me in silence. Then came the rain. The water crept higher in the fields, flooding the surrounding farmland until it looked like a massive patchwork of tiny islands, like an upside-down hourglass filled with muddy water. Only a narrow strip of dry land surrounded each building. I could still manage the short walk from my barn to the chicken coop behind the farmhouse, but it was getting risky. The next morning, as I gathered eggs, he was there again, staring at me. I felt like a prisoner under constant surveillance. He seemed distrustful, and I admit I had my own suspicions about him, but we were stuck in near isolation, so I thought I'd attempt a friendly gesture. I couldn't sell the eggs anyway, not with the roads flooded and markets practically shut down. They'd go bad soon, so I offered him a basket with half a dozen. He placed his coffee mug on the railing and reached for the basket. There was plenty of room to grab it, but instead of just taking it, his hand brushed against mine as if it were an accident. Then he pulled 2 eggs out of the basket. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself lockdown could make anyone awkward or lonely, so I let it go. "You can take more if you want," I said, trying to be polite. "These are enough for now," he replied, his voice carrying a tone I couldn't decipher. I laughed nervously and hurried off before the encounter grew more uncomfortable. That night, desperately bored, I tried to distract myself, but I kept hearing strange creaking noises around the barn. At first, I brushed them off. Old barns squeak and groan all the time. But the noises persisted, even as I tried to sleep. Eventually, sheer exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of my front door slamming. My first thought was of my neighbor. Farm girls learned to be tough, and I refused to let some eerie stranger intimidate me in my own home. I grabbed the baseball bat leaning next to my bed and rushed to the door. My hands trembled as I pulled on the handle. It wouldn't budge. It was a heavy wooden door with a solid lock, and nobody could open it without a key. Realizing my mistake, that no one could have come in that way, I breathed a laugh of relief and went back to bed. Dawn broke, and hunger pulled me into the kitchen. I fired up the old stove and brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the cramped space. I started making breakfast, reaching for 2 eggs from the basket. As soon as I cracked one into the frying pan, a disturbing realization hit me. The basket was empty. I had gathered 6 eggs the day before, and even though my neighbor had taken 2, 4 should have been left. Fear and adrenaline shook my legs. Emergency responders wouldn't make it out here in time, not with the roads flooded and so many areas under lockdown restrictions. I had to handle this alone. I left the barn and hurried through the half-submerged gravel path toward the farmhouse. I climbed onto the slick wooden porch, but before I could even knock, I slipped and fell hard. I tried to get up, but the water pooling beneath me caused me to slide again. When my hand reached my face, I saw red, blood. I stifled a scream by pressing my mouth against my upper arm, trying not to make a sound. Glancing around, I noticed the blood trail extended all the way back to the chicken coop. I looked up at the brooding gray sky and silently prayed for strength before approaching the coop. Inside, I found the chickens, their heads severed and scattered across the soaked earth. "Thanks for the eggs," came a voice behind me, low and disturbingly familiar. Slowly, I turned to see my neighbor leaning in the doorway, gripping his usual cup of coffee. I had no reason to hold back now. I shrieked at the top of my lungs, startling him enough that he dropped his mug. I seized that split second to run. He chased me. I managed to reach the barn and slammed the door behind me, quickly turning the lock. But a wave of terror hit me. He must have had a key to get in before, and he'd accessed the coop without forcing the lock. My heart pounded as I sprinted to my room, grabbed both my phone and my baseball bat. He pounded on the barn door, each thud as relentless as my heartbeat. I dialed 911, but the call was garbled by weak reception. I decided to call my mother instead. "Mom, which keys did you give the new renter?" I practically yelled into the phone. I don't know. What's going on?" she asked, alarmed. "Mom, did you give that creepy man a key to my barn?" "No, Gary handled the spare keys, but I told him not to give the barn key away." "What's happening?" she pleaded. I had no time to explain. I hung up and immediately tried Uncle Gary. Suddenly, the pounding on the door stopped. I heard a long vibration from my phone, followed by stumbling sounds coming from the kitchen. Then the noise died, replaced by a shrill ring in my ear. I crept toward the kitchen, and there, like a nightmare made real, stood Uncle Gary, clutching a bloody knife. I spun toward the front door, flinging it open, but before I could escape, someone yanked my hair, pulling me back. I swung the bat blindly, but Gary tore it from my grip, tossed it aside, and pinned me down. Panic flooded my mind. I thought that was it for me. But just then, the door burst open. My neighbor stood there, silhouetted by the morning light, almost like some unlikely hero. Without missing a beat, he scooped the bat off the floor. Gary lunged at him, but my neighbor sidestepped, pivoted, and delivered a swift strike to his temple. As Gary collapsed, my rescuer reached for my hand. This time, I was grateful beyond measure. He pulled me to my feet, and together we dashed to the barn. My neighbor called the police while I kept watch. Despite the pandemic restrictions, local emergency services arrived sooner than I would have believed. From a window, I saw their red and blue lights reflecting off the floodwaters, though the officers hesitated before wading in deeper. Before long, Uncle Gary stumbled out, hands raised in surrender. He sloshed through the water and gave himself up. To be honest, I felt a small pang of sympathy for him. Looking back, I don't think his intention was truly to harm me, but in his state, grief-stricken, probably not sober, anything could have happened if my neighbor hadn't intervened. Gary was sentenced to a year behind bars for assault and eventually ended up living with Martin again, who keeps me updated from time to time. There's now a restraining order against Uncle Gary, though sometimes I glimpse him lurking in the background when Martin and I talk over a video call. Word is, he's quit drinking and is trying to put his life back together. Still, I'm nowhere near ready to forgive him. Grief can twist people in terrifying ways, and some wounds don't heal so easily. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood near Seattle with my daughter Lily and my son Ryan. Their mother has not been part of our lives for 2 years. Not deceased, just a complete jerk. And as a single father, I've managed surprisingly well. We live in a 2-bedroom townhouse in a well-kept community. I have a steady job, and thankfully, the kids are healthy. Everything went smoothly until one night 2 months ago, when Ryan suddenly jabbed me in the face. He was sobbing hard, but I could tell from his crying that he was scared, not hurt, which somewhat reassured me. Ryan has frequent nightmares, so I assumed he'd just had another one. When I asked him what was wrong, he trembled and whispered, "The man in the house next door is making creepy faces at me." I had heard his stories of monsters lurking in the dark corners of his room before, but this was something new. I assumed he was referring to the house next door. However, the lack of fantastical elements worried me. It sounded too specific for a typical nightmare. I got up and, with Ryan trailing behind, went to the kids' bedroom. Lily was already awake on the top bunk. From the soft glow of her nightlight, I could see her arms crossed, glaring disapprovingly at her little brother. Not wanting to disturb the outside too much by turning on a light, I crept to the bedroom window. The curtains were slightly ajar, so Ryan was probably spying outside. The neighboring townhouse to our left was visible from Lily's and Ryan's room. There were 2 windows on that side, but it was too dark inside to see anything clearly. I recalled that the left window, facing the street, belonged to the kitchen. I didn't know what was behind the right window because the curtains there were always drawn. I asked Lily if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. He always has nightmares and cries. I don't want to sleep in the same room with him anymore, Dad. I can't get any peace. It's not fair. Hearing that, Ryan began to cry again. I decided to let him sleep in my bedroom that night. He had this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles tent he preferred to sleep in rather than his own bed. Honestly, I started to think his nightmare was just an excuse to camp out with me. Still, for the next 2 nights I allowed him to set up his tent in my room. On the 3rd night, I was woken again, this time by Lily, who stood over me shaking my arm. This girl hadn't woken me in the middle of the night for years. When I asked what happened, she whispered, "The neighbor made faces at me." Her words and the fear in her voice truly shook me. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Just a bit, but I heard a strange noise." "What did you hear?" Lily couldn't say exactly. She told me she'd gotten up to check, and when she pulled the curtain aside, she saw light in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room were drawn, and our neighbor was standing right in the window frame. "What did he do?" Lily thought for a moment. Then her face twisted into an expression I never want to see again. Not with my child or anyone else. It's hard to describe. First, she grinned so widely that a thin sliver between her teeth was visible. Then she furrowed her brows. She tilted her head toward me as if seriously urging me to pay attention, and tensed her neck muscles. The worst was what she did with her hands. She extended her left arm as if demonstrating something, then clenched her right fist and moved it quickly back and forth over her left forearm. The poor child called it playing the violin, but it was clear she was trying to suggest that someone was cutting. Disturbed, I told Lily not to repeat that gesture or make that face again. I was angry and confused. Our neighbor, a man in his 40s, was somewhat reclusive, but had always behaved normally when I'd spoken to him a few times. I couldn't understand why he would do such a thing to my kids. After more questions, it became clear that my neighbor might not have been doing anything technically illegal. Making inappropriate gestures in one's own house isn't against the law, but he seemed to be deliberately harassing my children. Whether it was legal or not, I planned to confront him the next morning. My final question to Lily was if the neighbor made any other gestures. She nodded and then started waving both hands in a "come here" motion. I let Lily sleep in my bedroom too. Once, I went to the window in the kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was dark. The next morning, before heading to work, and after dropping Lily and Ryan off at school, I knocked on my neighbor's front door for several minutes. I suspected he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he didn't answer. Eventually, I had to leave, and when I turned around to see if he was watching me, I caught a glimpse of him at the front window before he ducked under the windowsill and disappeared from view. Clearly, the man was a coward, and obviously, he had problems. I shouted after him, telling him to stop messing with us, then walked away. That same night, I devised a plan. While my kids slept in my room, I lingered in their bedroom. It was Friday evening, and I was determined to stay awake all night to catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my children, I wanted to be sure something truly unsettling was happening before I took the next step. I made sure all the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn tightly. After putting Lily and Ryan to bed, I sat on the floor under their window. Around 9 o'clock, I started a midnight mass app on my phone. I wasn't using headphones so I wouldn't miss any unusual noises, and I kept the volume low while reading the subtitles. At midnight, I began to hear strange noises. As Lily had described, it was hard to pinpoint. A deep, repetitive click-clack, almost like the sound someone might make when spurring a horse. I knew it was coming from a person. After a few minutes, the sound transformed into a weird whistle, more like someone sucking in air between their teeth. The noise was so clear that the neighbor's window must have been open, unsettling, given that our houses were only a few meters apart. Certain now that my neighbor was at his window and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and jerked the curtain aside in one swift motion. I saw him immediately. A dim light illuminated his room, and I recognized the horrifying expression Lily had made earlier, only even more terrifying on an adult. His window was open, and his outstretched arms were moving jerkily, as if he was hurting himself. When he noticed me, realizing he was being watched by another adult instead of a scared child, he froze. His cartoonish grin vanished, replaced by real anger. The man grabbed the window frame and slammed it shut with such force that the curtain snapped closed. I quickly drew my curtain back and stood still for a moment. The sight of the man, his twisted face, his movements, it was awful to know that night after night he had done this to terrify my children. But even more disturbing was the fact that I wasn't entirely sure the man I just saw was indeed my neighbor. I had barely seen him over the years, and I could hardly recall his face clearly. I sat down on the floor for a moment, my heart pounding in my ears. Did I now have enough evidence to call the police? Just as I was about to grab my phone, something suddenly hit the glass of the children's room window with a heavy thud. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain aside again. Inside, no light glowed anymore, and outside, no one was in sight. I pulled the curtain further and discovered a handprint high on the window. Our house sits on an elevated foundation, and that window is unusually high. Even though it's on the ground floor, a man outside would have needed tremendous effort to get his hand there. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. While speaking with the dispatcher, I quietly walked around the house to try to spot the man. My final stop was our bedroom. Inside, I locked the doors and, still connected to the dispatcher, retrieved a hidden gun from a safe in my closet. My heart pounded to my throat, but I knew I had to stay calm, especially when I saw Lily awake, peering over from her tent. In hushed tones, I assured her that we were safe, but that we needed to be extremely quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, the pistol at the ready, listening tensely. The kid's tent was in a corner, and to its left, centered on the wall opposite my bed, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and moonlight shimmered through the white curtains. A dark figure stood out, initially blurry, but gradually becoming clearer as the man outside moved closer to the window. Somehow, he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I was grateful that Lily couldn't see him from her spot. Then something happened that I could hardly comprehend. The man stepped back from the window, raised his arms, and formed a sort of Y shape with his body and limbs. Only his arms were far too long, nearly twice the normal length, each arm about as long as his entire body. At first, I thought he was holding something, perhaps 2 rods to extend his limbs, but I could clearly see 5 fingers at each end, trembling uncontrollably as he brought his arms closer to the window. Click, click, click. I stood up, ready to shoot, when suddenly the sound of police sirens shattered the quiet night. The man outside struck the window one last time with his hands, and it was as if someone had severed his arms at elbow height. His forearms seemed to detach, and the man ran off before they could hit the ground. As the police announced their presence, I hesitantly opened the door and told them what had happened. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me several questions about my neighbor, probably trying to find grounds for further action. After taking notes, they instructed me to stay inside with doors locked while they secured and investigated the neighbor's house. Through the kids' room window, I watched as they approached the house next door. They knocked on the door, and when no one answered, they tried the entrance. I saw the unlocked door swing open. The two officers exchanged worried looks and cautiously entered the house. I don't know exactly what they found inside. All I know is that they both looked visibly shaken when they emerged moments later. When I went outside to ask what they had discovered, the female officer simply said, "Your neighbor is dead." The rest of the night blurred into a sea of uniformed officers coming and going from the neighbor's house. Several police officers and investigators gathered at my door, asking questions. None of them provided clear answers. They operated strictly according to protocol, their faces solemn, their words terse and matter-of-fact. Eventually, I stepped aside near the house and saw several people outside taking photographs by my bedroom window. Before they asked me to leave, I spotted from the shadows the gruesome shape of two human arms lying on the ground. Since then, Lily, Ryan, and I have been staying with my parents for months. No one wants to stay in that house anymore. Lily is too traumatized, and I don't feel comfortable there as long as the murderer or the mystery behind it remains unsolved. I want to sell that damn house, but our story, which briefly made the news, makes it difficult. Who would want a house that's forever associated in the media with words like dismemberment, days of torment, and victims barely recognizable as human? I have to tell you something that's got me absolutely terrified right now. Let me give you the background. I'm 24 years old, and I live in the same Brooklyn apartment where I grew up. It's an old brownstone that's been divided into two separate units. One of them is a subsidized housing unit run by a community program, and the other one is privately owned. The apartment directly above mine is used as a sort of rehabilitation or transitional housing space, so my neighbors up there change frequently. Usually, if someone has trouble adapting, they end up back in a residential program. And then I get a new neighbor. Up until now, I've been really lucky and never had any issues. About 4 months ago, a new neighbor named Mark moved in upstairs. Sometimes, if a new neighbor had a record or past issues, I'd get a visit from a social worker who would let me know to call a specific number if there were any problems. This often happened if someone had a violent history, but they never shared personal info. Anyway, Mark moved in, and for the first week, I heard nothing. Normally, I make an effort to be friendly with my neighbors. After all, we share the same building, and lots of them are dealing with mental health challenges. But every time I knocked on his door, there was no response. Finally, I gave up and slipped a note under his door, introducing myself and telling him I was around if he ever needed anything. 2 days later, I came home from playing golf with some friends and ran into him in the stairwell. He seemed really nice, very open, and it put me at ease. We ended up talking for a while and discovered we were both big New York Giants fans. I mentioned I'd just come back from golfing, and he said he liked to consider himself a golfer too. I reminded him about my note and told him to call if he ever needed anything. That night, I felt a lot more relaxed going to bed. It's wild to write all of this down now, but I need to share the story. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark and I got pretty close. He dropped by some evenings after work to watch football, and we'd hang out with a couple of beers. He told me about his rehab program and how he'd been in a toxic relationship that nearly drove him insane. It felt a bit odd because I'd never opened up so much to a neighbor before. Normally, I kept a friendly but distant relationship with the folks upstairs. But even though I never pictured myself in a situation like Mark's, I could weirdly understand his feelings, He seemed like a decent guy who'd had something awful happen to him and then lost his way for a while. Since we lived in the same building, we saw a lot of each other. But I wasn't worried about it. It felt natural. We liked the same music, supported the same team, and were into sports. It was easy. One day, after a super long shift at work, I came home. My boss had been a jerk all day, and I was exhausted, just wanting to crash. Mark must have heard me come in because he came down to my door and asked if he could hang out. I told him I wasn't really up for company. He looked a little disappointed, but I'd had a terrible day and needed sleep. When I finally crawled into bed, I noticed something really strange, and I still get chills just thinking about it. There was a clear impression of a body on my bedsheet, like someone had been lying there not long before. I stared at it. I rubbed my eyes, but I knew I hadn't been on the bed since I made it that morning. In fact, I didn't even recall messing up the covers at all. Still, I was too tired to think straight. I pulled the covers back and went to sleep. In the following weeks, I saw less and less of Mark for a variety of reasons. My job, other commitments, and the feeling that I needed a little space. We had become so close that it was almost intense, and because we lived so close by, it was too much for me sometimes. I felt bad for Mark. He hadn't done anything wrong, but I needed my own breathing room. Then one night, I was letting a friend crash in my apartment after a late night out. She lived pretty far away, and the buses had stopped running. It was around 4 a.m, and I was trying to be really quiet as I went up to my door. The second I unlocked it, I heard footsteps inside my place. I was high at the time and panicked, but I didn't want to freak out my friend. I grabbed a golf club I keep in the hall closet and crept toward the kitchen where I heard the noise. I flipped on the light and rushed in, and there was Mark. He was sitting on my kitchen counter smiling. I swear, I've never been so terrified in my life. Of course, I asked him what in the world he was doing in my kitchen at 4 a.m, and he mumbled something about borrowing milk. I demanded to know how he got in, but he just kept quiet. Then he asked who my friend was, in a tone that suggested he was jealous, like he thought we were a couple. He left shortly after, and my friend and I went to bed. But here's the weirdest part. My bed was turned down like it had been slept in, my TV was on, and my closet door was wide open. He'd been in my room. How long had he been there? The next morning, I couldn't think about anything else. It was beyond strange, way too strange. I wasn't sure if I should call the social worker. In hindsight, I obviously should have, but I didn't. Instead, I avoided him at all costs. I think he knew he'd gone way over the line, because he didn't try talking to me either. So, this brings us to where we are now. A few days ago, my mom called to ask about my job, and I told her I was thinking of quitting. To keep the story focused, my boss is honestly the worst. He overworks me, underpays me, and makes fun of me. We hung up, and I went to sleep. 2 days later, this morning, I went into work. My boss wasn't around, which was a relief, and I got on with my tasks until a close colleague told me our boss had been whacked with a golf club the night before and was in the hospital. I felt guilty because a part of me was almost relieved he wasn't in the office. Apparently, he'd recover, but there were 2 suspects, and no one had revealed who they were yet. It didn't surprise me that someone would have it out for him. He was just that kind of person. So when I got home tonight, I was in a slightly better mood since work went smoothly. By my apartment door, I found a note from the social worker asking me to give her a call. I did, and she told me that Mark had been arrested. Now that I'm writing this all out, it seems obvious in retrospect. But you have to understand that real life isn't like a movie. You don't assume bizarre things like this will happen to you. Sure, it might happen to someone in another state, but not in my Brooklyn apartment. She said she couldn't disclose anything more, but I already knew. That call made me panic even more. I ran upstairs and kicked in his door. I'd never done anything like that. It felt like I was on autopilot, powered by adrenaline, but I had to know what was going on. Oh God, my stomach turns just typing this. I'm alone in my apartment and I'm scared. I'm 24 and I'm afraid in my own home. I went into Mark's apartment right above mine. There was nothing outwardly strange. It looked almost exactly like my own unit, with a closet and Giants posters. But then I noticed something very creepy. A camera propped up, pointing straight at the floor. It looked like he'd just set it there, so at first I didn't think it was that weird. Above it, though, there were videotapes. I had no idea he recorded anything, but on a closer look, all the cassettes had my name on them and described things I do, like talking to Mom, watching TV, hanging out with a girl. My stomach just clenched. I kept thinking, please no, please no. I turned on the VCR and saw it. A clear gap between the floorboards, angled right at my bed. It was located directly above my closet, so I never would have noticed it. I called the police immediately. They came right away. And at that point, I finally found out the truth about his past and this so-called toxic relationship. Turns out he had been stalking a girl he knew from high school, and she actually moved states to get away from him before he ended up in that treatment program. The police just left, and now I'm sitting here alone in my apartment. My neighbor watched me for 4 months through a hole in my ceiling, and I only just discovered it. I'm at the end of my rope with fear. I live in a quiet suburb of Chicago, in a residential neighborhood where neighbors are friendly yet rather reserved. Every morning, as I drive to work, I see children patiently waiting at the bus stop. In the afternoon, when I return home, I greet my neighbors politely, while some work in their yards, mowing lawns, washing cars, or tending to gardens. It's a typical scene of an American suburban community. Last week, I noticed something unusual at the Miller's house, just 2 houses down from mine. The Miller family has 3 children, and normally someone is always outside in the yard or busy with activities. Since moving here, I can hardly recall a single sunny day when the Millers weren't out enjoying the fresh air or working on some project at home. Not seeing them for days filled me with an uneasy feeling. At first, I attributed it to my busy schedule. Maybe they were traveling or tied up with something. That can happen, I told myself, even though a small voice inside whispered that something was off. I decided to discreetly check on them. On my way to the Miller's house, the usual calm of the neighborhood struck me. No unusual noises. Children playing in the distance, the sun shining. Everything seemed normal. But then I noticed something odd. A lawnmower sat in the middle of a half-cut lawn, as if someone had abruptly stopped mowing. I stared at the machine, hoping it might tell me why, but it offered no answers. Cautiously, I approached the front porch. I hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. My knock echoed strangely loud on the pavement, and an eerie silence fell. Not even the Miller family dog, which I knew usually barked, responded. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I knocked again. No answer. I quietly peered over the windowsill. The inside of the house was in disarray, as one might expect from a family with children, yet there were no signs of a violent struggle. There were no people in sight at all. I shifted my position to get a view of the dining room. On the table stood plates with half-eaten food. My heart started pounding. I needed to know what had happened, but I didn't want to force my way into the house. Despite my reservations, I hesitantly grabbed the doorknob, closed my eyes, and turned it. The door slowly creaked open. Whether that relieved or frightened me, I couldn't tell. Stepping in slowly, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" A suffocating silence answered me. I crept cautiously into the kitchen. There, I saw plates with half-eaten food, flies buzzing around, and chairs left as if everyone had abruptly left the meal unfinished. "Where could they have gone?" I whispered. I continued into the living room. The TV was off. The space looked lived in but abandoned. Cushions lay scattered on the couch and the floor, yet there were no signs of a struggle. If something had happened, it seemed to have been peaceful. Perhaps the family had left the table and suddenly retreated somewhere else. I glanced out the window into the backyard but saw nothing unusual. Then I turned toward the staircase, wondering whether I should check upstairs or in the basement. Since I avoided basements, I decided to go upstairs. "I'm going upstairs to see if everything is okay," I called into the empty house, even though it sounded strange. "Please don't shoot. I'm just a concerned neighbor." With a pounding heart, I continued. Reaching the top of the stairs, I paused on the first step, facing the bedrooms, listening intently. The absence of familiar household noises made each of my steps echo loudly. I opened the first door I came to. The room was lovingly set up for a little girl. Pink walls, a corner filled with princess toys, yet no one was there. I found similar scenes in the next two rooms, a teenager's room and the parents' bedroom. Everything appeared abandoned. The further I went, the more my unease grew. At the end of the hallway, I stood before the bathroom door. Dark thoughts painted grim scenarios as I slowly opened it. The bathroom was spotless. In that moment, I wondered how the family kept their tiles so pristine. After searching the upper floor, the thought of checking the basement overwhelmed me. I returned downstairs, hesitating at the top of the staircase. A mild dizziness overcame me, much like those moments in movies when someone dreads descending a dark staircase. I switched on the light, took a deep breath, grabbed the railing, and walked down. The basement was surprisingly neat, with a large TV, a cozy sofa, and even a small bar area in a corner. A typical American basement that doubles as a living space. Just as I was about to head back up, something caught my eye. A sneaker jutting out from the shadows next to the sofa. Slowly, I approached, my mind conjuring scenes of horror. Rounding a corner, I stumbled upon something monstrous. The sneaker lay on the body of a teenager. I'd seen him often, helping out in the yard. Now he lay lifeless on his back, stiff, eyes wide open. Next to him lay 4 other bodies, his family members. They were arranged with outstretched heads, forming a sort of star shape. I leaned down, searching for a pulse on the teen. Nothing. Then I moved to the next body, a little girl about 8 years old, and checked her as well. Her eyes were wide open, devoid of life. I did this with all 5 people in the eerie star formation. No pulse, no visible injuries, no blood. It was uncanny, as if they could rise at any moment and pretend nothing had happened. Trembling, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher told me that police and emergency crews were on their way and asked me to stay at the scene. Despite the urge to flee, I stayed and waited. 9 minutes later, officers arrived and began questioning me extensively. I had to recount the story several times, as the police documented everything according to strict protocols. Once their immediate curiosity was satisfied, I asked an EMT about the cause of death. He shook his head. He was just as baffled. Eventually, they let me go but asked me to remain available for further questions. A standard practice, so witnesses can be re-interviewed later. I went home, but the wide, dead eyes of the victims haunted my thoughts. The next day, on my way to work, I flipped through the newspaper. There were no reports about the Miller family. Perhaps the media would wait for official statements before publishing anything. That evening, as I drove home, I couldn't take my eyes off the abandoned house. The oppressive silence was the same. Even though I didn't want to, my legs seemed to carry me there of their own accord. I stopped, parked in front of the house, and saw yellow police tape surrounding the yard. A police cruiser was parked next to the house. An officer stepped out and asked politely, "You're the neighbor who reported the incident yesterday?" "Yes," I replied. "What brings you here today?" "I've noticed that other houses in the neighborhood are unusually quiet as well. Have you heard of any more incidents?" The officer shook his head. "I'm here to secure this crime scene," he explained. "I can't comment on other neighborhood cases." I asked if he could join me in checking other houses, but he politely declined, saying he was only responsible for this area. We exchanged a few words, but he didn't reveal many details, just how these conversations go, formal and guarded. After saying goodbye, my inner urge drew me back to the Miller's house. I wanted to check on my own again, though I knew I needed to be cautious. I knocked on the door once more, but there was no answer. This time, I noticed the officer's stern gaze from the edge of the yard as I approached. I stepped up to the door again, opened it quietly, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. I listened. Only the faint ticking of a mantel clock could be heard. A familiar voice suddenly whispered in my ear, "Maybe they're only away for a little while. Keep looking." Startled, I spun around quickly and saw the police officer standing behind me. "Please, don't come any closer," I stammered nervously. He raised his hands in a calming gesture. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't putting yourself in danger," he replied calmly. I took a deep breath, letting my eyes roam over the kitchen where plates with half-eaten food still sat, trying not to imagine anything terrible. But my gaze drifted to the basement door, which radiated an eerie aura. My stomach clenched. I felt that something was wrong down there. The officer noticed my tension. "Maybe we should check together, but carefully," he suggested. I hesitated, then nodded. Together, we approached the basement door, opened it slowly, and descended. The scent of old brick and preserved fruits greeted us. In the dim light of the basement, we noticed two lifeless bodies lying in the middle of the room. An older couple, apparently victims of the same fate as the Millers. Their heads were stacked on top of each other, eyes wide open, without any signs of life. "Oh my God," the officer whispered, pulling out his notepad. A deep dread washed over me as I knelt beside him to take in the scene. The officer meticulously noted everything while I stood there, frozen in shock. After reporting the discovery, the investigators questioned me again. I repeated what I had done. The strict, factual procedures of the police gave me a sense of security, yet my fear grew. The victims were close by. What did that mean for me? Late that night, I returned home. The streets were quiet, neighbors keeping their distance. As I stepped onto my porch, I saw the blue and red lights of emergency vehicles in the distance. It dawned on me. The first victims were just a few houses away. The next door, neighbors had been taken. Was I next? A cold shiver ran down my spine, even though it was warm outside. I decided to take some time off and leave the area. On the phone, I explained to my boss that I urgently needed a week off, a formal request that was quickly approved in this American workplace setting. I packed a suitcase without a specific destination, just away from here. Only a few articles of clothing and at the last minute a swimsuit. I just wanted to get away. I put my mail on hold, grabbed the suitcase, and left the house. Back at home in my kitchen, I fixed a bowl of cereal. As I ate, an odd feeling of calm settled over me. yet also a longing, as if I wasn't where I was meant to be. My mind went blank. I dropped the cereal bowl, stood up, and found myself wandering aimlessly toward the basement door. It felt like there was no other way. Without really knowing why, I opened the door, stepped down, and quietly closed it behind me. As I descended, a strange sense of belonging washed over me. In the middle of the basement, I sank to the floor and stared at the ceiling, unable to move. The feeling of peace quickly faded, replaced by a crushing fear. My eyes widened as the terrible truth about my neighbors became clear to me. With all my strength, I tried to move, to turn around, to do something, but I was paralyzed. It felt as if invisible hands were holding me down. A rushing sound like water filled my mind, accompanied by a deafening roar, as if a storm raged inside me. I had a dreadful feeling that my soul was being sucked out of my body. An ominous giggle reached my ear as I fought in vain against the inevitable. The smell of sulfur filled the air. I felt myself falling, gasping for air, desperately trying to free myself. But it was in vain. I was completely helpless. Suddenly, I felt other hands grab and lift me. The rushing sound and giggling ceased. I sensed the air thick with anger. A violent struggle ensued, and then a loud bang. I felt weightless, as though I were an object suddenly detached. With a painful thud, I landed on the basement floor. I opened my eyes and saw the officer, who had warned me hours earlier, kneeling beside me, breathing heavily. I looked up at him. "What just happened?" I whispered, dazed. He struggled to sit up. "I came back to check on you when I found you down here. You were motionless. I didn't know what to do, so I instinctively prayed for help." I nodded weakly. "I'm glad you did." He looked at me seriously. "I think we should get out of here now." I followed him, feeling as uncertain as if I were sinking in quicksand, but determined to leave this place. We left the basement. I ran out of the house and never looked back. I share this story as a warning. If you ever feel pulled by invisible forces against your will, whether you're in America or elsewhere, seek help immediately, pray for assistance, or contact the authorities. In such moments, instinctive action may be your only salvation. Last night, I caught my neighbor staring at me through the window. I only noticed her by chance as I passed my living room window in a typically quiet suburb outside of Chicago, where each single-story house sits neatly in a row with small front yards and tidy hedges. Under the faint light of the late-night street lamp, I suddenly saw the elderly woman from next door. She was perched on her couch, fixedly glaring at me with a look of utter horror. It was as though she were in a trance. Her eyes bulged in her weathered, leathery face, and the lines around her mouth drew tight as if she might collapse at any moment. I felt a lump in my throat that I just couldn't swallow. I waved at her, but that only seemed to make things worse. Her eyes welled up, her teeth clenched, and her fists tightened before going limp again. Though her body trembled, she didn't budge an inch, as if trapped in some hypnotic state, staring straight into my soul. I felt my chest tighten as my mind started spinning with paranoid scenarios. What was wrong with her? A seizure? A shock? Or was it a surge of rage that contorted her face like that? Instead of panicking and running, I inched closer, hoping not to let my fear take full control of me. That's when I saw her grandson, a boy named Luke, come running up to her. He looked about 10 years old and often stayed with his grandma on weekends. He waved a colorful drawing in her face and giggled, but she didn't react in the slightest. Eventually, she took his head in both hands and turned him so he was looking right out the window at me. When he turned around, he gave me the exact same blank stare. His eyes went wide, cold, and unnatural. He lifted his arm and pointed at me without blinking. The stare was both lifeless and intense, sending an icy chill down my spine. I wondered if he could understand me at all. Silently, I mouthed, "Do you need help?" Not sure if he was in trouble. The boy's head began to swivel from side to side, all while maintaining his stare. Suddenly, his small body seemed limp, as though he might collapse any second. That was proof enough that something terribly wrong was happening here. I slid my window shut and yanked down the blinds, desperately hoping to block out those staring eyes. It felt as though icy needles were creeping along my neck. I could hardly breathe. I reached for my inhaler, but before I could grab it, my gaze drifted again, this time to the side window that overlooked my front yard. My body shook as I registered the forms of two more neighbors, a husband and wife, standing in the yard. This couple was usually so friendly, but now they looked completely changed. They both stood there, unmoving, as though every bit of expression had drained from their faces. The wife's expression was twisted into a mask of silent hysteria and intense tension, while her husband, only a few feet away, kept licking his lips nervously, glaring at me as if he wanted to break right through the glass. I felt my lungs tighten further as I tried to process what was happening. It was as though all my neighbors were suddenly possessed by something, and I was the sole focus of it. I sprinted across my living room, nearly tripping over the corner of the couch in my haste to pull down the blinds. In a panic, I yanked down the blinds and started screaming. Before I spun around, I caught sight of the mailman near the curb, frozen in mid-delivery. His USPS jacket was partially lit by the street lamp, and he stood there, perfectly still, staring at me with that same eerie intensity. When I finally managed to pull the kitchen curtain shut, I decided I'd had enough. I snatched my phone off the dining table and dialed 911. The woman on the line, sounding tired and mildly irritated, assured me that an officer would be dispatched. Her tone suggested she might think I was drunk or making it up. I didn't care as long as help arrived. Shortly after, I heard the authoritative pounding on my front door, the kind of knock cops use to ensure they're taken seriously. "Police! Open up! We got a call about a disturbance," a man's voice shouted. I let out a sigh of relief, imagining the staring people had now scattered with the arrival of a patrol car. I was ready to explain that maybe it was all a horrific prank. I sighed with relief, only to have it vanish in a flash. Again, they knocked, louder this time. "Police! Please open the door." I hurried over and pulled the door wide, about to admit to some embarrassing misunderstanding, only to find myself staring into two blank faces that looked more like puppets than people. With the power of a jet engine, I screamed, slamming the door in their faces. It dawned on me that if the police were also affected, I couldn't rely on them. I tore back through the hallway, consumed by the need to find a place without windows. The only place I could hide without being watched was my basement. I raced down the steps. My thoughts were spinning wildly, flashing through the horrifying images of those wide-eyed, distorted faces, a kaleidoscope of terror. I yanked open the basement door so forcefully that the hinges nearly tore off. The knob slammed into the wall with a crack. I tumbled down the wooden stairs, heart pounding so loud it might burst. I felt trapped in some lurid nightmare. Quietly, I crept down the creaking steps into the musty gloom. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale mildew. A single bare light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a weak glow. I tried to recall the last time I was down here. Probably when I was looking for a spare folding chair earlier, expecting friends later that evening. My memory was a blur now. Just as I reached about the 10th step from the bottom, I froze. A nervous chill spread over my skin at the sound of a faint whisper. Someone was down there, muttering to themselves, interspersed with a deep, unsettling laugh. It sounded like a knife cutting through fresh flesh. Slash, laugh, slash, then a sudden shout. My bones turned to ice. Going back upstairs was out of the question, not with those staring eyes lurking around. Maybe I could slip past this person, find some kind of weapon, and barricade myself in the far corner of the basement. Slowly, I descended the last few steps, each one groaning beneath my weight. As soon as my feet touched the cold concrete floor, the laughter and mumbling stopped. The sudden silence was so thick that my own heartbeat echoed in my ears. In the dim, dank cellar, a single yellow-orange bulb cast eerie shadows. The metallic smell of spilled blood filled my nostrils. I had to fight the urge to gag as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Beneath that weak pool of light stood a man in a tattered olive jacket and dirty jeans, clutching a bloody knife. He was rocking on the balls of his feet, eyes so wide they seemed ready to pop out of his skull. His chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, his entire body humming with a frantic energy I'd never witnessed before. He simply stood there, staring, as though caught in his own horrific loop. A sticky, dark puddle had formed around his shoes, and the air was thick with the stench of iron. Dread twisted in my gut as I realized what lay at his feet. At his feet lay a mutilated corpse, the blood still steaming in the cool basement air. Its features were barely recognizable, disfigured by torn flesh and congealed gore. My heart thudded violently, as if trying to shatter my ribcage. I wanted to scream, to run back upstairs, to go anywhere but here. Yet every fiber of my being seemed paralyzed. Above me, terror waited. Below, something worse. It felt like falling endlessly into a dark, endless pit. Not because a murderer was in my house, not because everyone in the neighborhood had stared into my soul that night. No, something else made my blood run cold. It was as if I'd stumbled into a mirror that revealed a truth too impossible to bear. Because when I looked more closely at the corpse beneath that blade in the flickering light, it was me. I must first say that I'm not really a social person. When the pandemic hit the United States, it was probably the best thing that could have happened to me. I already spend most of my time online since I work in data entry for a test proctoring company. It wasn't exactly fun, especially considering how crazy 2020 turned out to be, but that has nothing to do with the problem that keeps me awake these days. I just thought most people start these kinds of stories with a personal anecdote, so here you are. Long story short, I'd rather be left alone. In our small town in Vermont, my neighbors almost overdo it every year. The Miller family has 4 boys, all in elementary school, and of course, they want to celebrate the holidays in grand style. Why should 2020 be any different? Their house is right next to mine, so it's the first thing I see whenever I step outside. And now, thanks to their elaborate Halloween decorations, I'd be seeing even more of it. Day by day, the Millers added more. Here, they hung paper bats. There, they draped intricate cobwebs over the windows. I really tried to ignore it. I know how that sounds, like I'm the grumpy neighbor who hates Halloween, so I kept my irritation to myself. But a few nights ago, everything changed when I suddenly heard screams. It turned out they'd set up some speakers in the attic because the screams blasted out so intensely up there. It sounded as if they were playing actual recordings from a horror movie. Hearing that kind of noise at 3:30 a.m. was terrifying. Instinctively, I grabbed my phone and called 911. I explained that I couldn't sleep because of the noise and asked them to do something. Around here, the police generally respond quickly to nighttime disturbances, so they sent an officer out right away. The officer showed up, listened to my story, and noted that as long as no one else complained and no local ordinances were being violated, there wasn't much they could do. "That's unfortunate, but there's nothing actionable right now," he said politely, advising me to try to cope with the noise. I was disappointed, but couldn't deny he was correct. Still, I felt frustrated and hardly slept after that. Later that night, I went into the kitchen, poured myself a small glass of herbal whiskey, a typical drink for moments like these, and settled on the couch hoping to pinpoint where those nighttime screams were really coming from. By the next morning, slightly calmer, I decided to speak to my neighbors in person after breakfast. Walking over felt like navigating a minefield. Their once tidy front yard was now loaded with spooky jack-o'-lanterns, fake cobwebs, and plastic skeletons stuffed into the hedges. As I got closer, a strange unease crept over me. When I knocked on their door, hoping to get someone's attention, there was no answer. I knocked again, still nothing. So I walked around to the side entrance, which was loosely accessible. The door stood ajar, and I noticed right away that the Miller's car was gone. On the ground, I spotted some odd red plastic that looked like fake blood. Next to it lay a few severed prop limbs, decorations meant to simulate gore, obviously. The odor of damp leaves and old latex hung in the air. I covered my nose and tried calling out by the side door. Still no response. Letting out a deep sigh, I carefully stepped over the blood trail and paused to figure out the strange smell. Near the entrance lay some wet garbage bags, clearly soaked through by a recent rain. I assumed they were the culprit for the odor. Even though I didn't feel much kinship with my neighbors, I grabbed the garbage bags and hauled them over to the curb, hoping another neighbor might have noticed something unusual. But no one else seemed concerned. In fact, aside from the Miller's outlandish decorations, life in our small Vermont town had been pretty quiet. That night, I decided to record the strange screams to provide the authorities with possible evidence, be it for noise complaints or something more serious. Back at home, I showered, set up my recording equipment, and got ready to listen. But to my surprise, that night there was nothing, only an unsettling silence. I stayed up until the early morning hours, old-fashioned as that might sound. Maybe the Millers realized I had called the cops and decided to lie low. So I gave up and resolved to try again later. Several nights went by, no noise, no screams. I also noticed that none of the neighbors left their houses. Mornings were strangely quiet. Usually, I'd see the Miller kids waiting for the bus or the bus driver honking to get someone's attention. But now, there was silence. After a week, I started worrying seriously. I first told myself maybe I was just sleep-deprived, but then I began to question my own sanity. What if the scream I heard wasn't just a sound effect? That thought circled in my mind, refusing to leave. Had something horrible happened to the Millers? What if Joanna Miller, the wife, was attacked? A robbery? The images of severed heads and fake blood I'd seen suddenly seemed eerily plausible as an actual crime scene. My paranoia whispered, "Oh my God, how could you have missed the real danger?" I pulled on my bathrobe and headed out in the middle of the night toward the Miller's house. Clutching my phone tightly, I moved through our dark streets, adrenaline making my heart thump. The Miller's place was silent, no light anywhere. I wondered if it had always been so still. The spooky props still clung to the porch and windows, but it felt like they'd been untouched for far too long. Glancing into their garage, I saw no sign of blood. It looked like someone had cleaned up. An icy shiver ran down my back as I imagined terrifying possibilities. In my head, I played out scenarios. Maybe Chris Miller, the husband, had been plotting to poison Joanna because he was having an affair. I imagined him discreetly slipping something lethal into her meals over the months. then deciding 2020's chaos was the perfect cover. The scream might have been Joanna's last moment of realization. Maybe Chris decided he didn't want to wait any longer for the poison to act. I recalled vaguely seeing Chris talking quietly with a younger woman in a nearby diner. Could that have been his mistress? If so, it would make sense he'd grown distant from Joanna. But murder? That was an unspeakable leap. These thoughts swarmed in my mind, each one more horrifying than the last, as I stood near the garage trying to keep my composure. I had to enter the house, look for any clues. What if there was still evidence inside? I ran back to my own place, heart pounding, rummaged through my shed, and grabbed a crowbar I'd used for minor repairs. It was enough to pry open a door. My hands shook as I forced the miller's side door after a couple of tries, finally stepping into a dim, musty utility room. I tried flicking on the light, but nothing happened. Looked like the Millers might not have been keeping up with their bills. It felt colder than a tomb in there. My footsteps echoed as I called out, but no one responded. Suddenly, a life-size fake axe swung down from the wall, probably part of their decorations, and nearly hit me in the face. I jumped back in terror. It was just more of their creepy props, but it felt so real. Evidently, Chris had gone all out on his twisted Halloween scene just before he'd supposedly gone upstairs to take care of Joanna. I pictured the kids upstairs, probably playing video games when the screaming began, rushing to check on their mom, their father panicking at being discovered. Maybe he thought the games would drown out Joanna's cries, or that she was too weak to fight him off. But he must have been caught off guard, leading to a grisly chain of events. Cautiously, I made my way up the creaking stairs, chills crawling up my spine. How could a father go so far as to terrify his own kids? The thought that the children might have been hiding in some closet while he hunted them was horrifying. At the top of the stairs, I saw a ghastly sight. Something shaped like a body hung upside down among cobwebs and spiders, the head dangling. It was probably a prop designed to scare off intruders, but I nearly lost my nerve right then and there. I told myself I had to keep looking, in case there was any real evidence. But the room was empty, aside from more grisly decorations that seemed out of place. It was obvious that someone had staged a perfect Halloween nightmare while removing any genuine traces of wrongdoing. But where had the real evidence gone? I felt nauseous, remembering the fake blood, the severed decorations, and the horrifying possibility that Chris might have truly killed his family and used these props as a cover-up. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to steady my breathing against the unthinkable. Desperate, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, hoping I could show the authorities something later. Then I fled that house, too shaken to linger. The place felt haunted, and every second there made my skin crawl. Once back in my own home, I collapsed on the couch and tried to piece together the night's discoveries. The only detail that made no sense was the mysterious third party, the potential lover Chris might have had. Wouldn't that person be looking for Joanna, or at least be alarmed about her disappearance? Where was she? I tried to catch a few hours of sleep, tormented by nightmares of Chris hunting down anyone who knew too much, including me. But those thoughts stayed with me. The following morning, a sudden loud knock jolted me awake. I opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there, both looking serious. A neighbor had reported suspicious activity, screaming, disturbances, and now the authorities had a warrant to search the area. They explained they needed to inspect my home for any sign of criminal involvement. I was dumbfounded. I hadn't done anything wrong. Still, they searched every corner, bringing in K9 units and collecting evidence. They soon found some trash bags in my shed, filled with odd materials that smelled like damp wood and fabric, definitely not typical Halloween stuff. On top of that, they found my tools bearing my fingerprints, apparently matching marks found on certain suspicious objects around the Miller property. My stomach churned as it dawned on me that all of this pointed directly at me. Naturally, my prints would be on my own tools, but it looked incriminating. I tried to explain that I was just cleaning up the place and wanted to help the police find the real culprit, but I felt more and more cornered and misunderstood. The officers questioned me for hours, and I was certain I'd end up in prison for a crime I didn't commit. It felt like my life was unraveling. My hands shook as I tried to recount how this all began with the Millers' over-the-top Halloween setup. While talking, a chilling notion crept into my mind. What if all those screams and decorations were entirely staged? What if there was never a real crime, and the entire show had tricked my senses? My reality felt upside down. Seeing my panic, the officers let me step outside for fresh air. Out there, I glanced at the deserted Miller house. The once bright jack-o'-lanterns and all those ghoulish figures now looked sad and out of place. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The police found no concrete proof against me, but the investigation remained murky. The uncanny events surrounding the Millers stayed unsolved, and I was a suspect in a case that never truly began. The screams, the decorations, that suffocating sense of dread, they took root in my mind. One thing was certain: Halloween would never be the same for me again.